Hey Clashers, what is going on? It's Ash here coming at you today in Clash Royale, and I'm bringing back Woody for the fourth time to review his card popularity snapshot. We try to add something a little bit different, a little bit new to all of these conversations. In this conversation, we're going to kind of theme it around the future of the meta. We're going to speculate on what buffs and nerfs are needed in the game right now and how the meta might change as a result to it. So, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and bring in the man, the myth, the legend, Woody. All right, guys, so here I am joined by Woody. Woody, how you doing, man? Welcome back to the channel for the fourth time. How were your holidays, man?
I'm doing great. I was back home for the holidays, so it's good to be, back in Virginia now is where I work and do all the streaming from. So good to be back in the
Nice, man. Well,
swing.
welcome home, kind of. So today, I want to start with reviewing your popularity snapshot, talking about what we feel needs to happen in terms of buffs and nerfs, and what consequences that might have to the meta, and what implications that might have on the future of the meta. So that's going to be the game plan. Let's kind of get right to it. First of all, give us a brief synopsis on what you discovered or what major changes took place in your last snapshot.
Absolutely. So there was a little bit of a balancing out in the last snapshot. Some of the most popular cards dipped down a lot. The Mega Minion, Fireball, Zap, all three of these cards are in the top 4 of the most used cards, but all three of them also reduced in popularity. So we saw some cards that had not been used for many months, like the Balloon picking up in popularity. Goblin Barrel is coming back into the metagame. The popularity of Zap and the big heavy Fireball is bringing Minion Horde along with some other Zap bait cards back into the metagame. We've also seen Lava Hound being reintroduced at the top of the ladder. The max level Lava Hound has pups that survive a Zap, and so as more of these max level Lava Hounds are being produced by these very top players, the metagame is shifting at the top to take account for that.
Yeah, for sure. You know, I actually, before I, give my own input, what are your overall thoughts on the meta right now? Do you like it, not like it, indifferent?
I'm a fan. I really miss the Siege meta. That was my favorite, and I think that Mortar still needs a little bit more work to get it back up to where it belongs in the game. But overall, I think that there are multiple viable win conditions right now. There's not really too strong of a rock, paper, scissors where you either are dominant or just shut out of the game at the very beginning, depending upon your deck choice. So there's a lot of gameplay that's really vibrant right now, and I'm having fun in this current metagame.
Yeah, I agree with you, and partially because of the reasons that you just kind of outlined. And like the current meta, as with basically every meta, I don't know if some people maybe don't even understand what the term meta means, but basically the popular decks that are winning right now is, in a nutshell, it always gets a lot of hate, no matter what it is. If it was Goizen back in the day, or even before that, like Miner Control when the Miner was first introduced, but people always hate on whatever is popular and working. And me personally, I think that especially recently, this meta has actually shifted into a place where there's a lot of different viable decks. I mean, you kind of mentioned the air has recently seen a resurgence. You see those Lava Hound decks. You see the Balloon decks, especially the Balloons even without Lava Hound decks now. You see a lot of air. You see the Zap bait decks. You see that mirror deck, that mirror Zap bait deck that's kind of been, kind of annoying people here and there in tournament play and even some ladder play. And then, of course, you see, what are known as kind of the staples right now of this meta and even the previous cycle meta in the graveyard decks and now the new coming Elite Barbarians. But, what I'm trying to say is there's a lot of diversity there. There really is more than people kind of give it credit for, at least I think. So it sounds like you kind of agree there. So let me start by asking you about the big surprise on your list, and that is the Elite Barbarians. And they are actually staggeringly low usage rates among the top 100, and they're at 22%. That's not really going to square up with what viewers probably see in their own matches, I'm sure. Can you talk about why you suspect they're not higher in the top level play?
It's the exact same reason that Royal Giant used to be really high and then kind of dipped back down. the fact that you can max out this common card makes it extremely popular in the sort of 3 to 4K trophy range. But after a certain while, when the epics and the rares and the legendary cards even that the max level players are using, catch up to the strength of a max level common card, a card like the Elite Barbarians is very good, but it's easily countered if you have the right deck setup. It usually takes 2 cards to counter it, but at a 6 elixir investment, your opponent is putting a lot on the line. And if those Elite Barbarians don't ever reach the tower because you can, block them with an Ice Golem or stall them with a Skeleton Army, murder them with a Minion Horde, there's a lot of different ways to deal with them. And so I think the combination of the fact that they aren't often the most powerful card in your deck at the top of the ladder, and also really highly skilled players have become very familiar with how to counter it, has resulted in the Elite Barbarians dipping in popularity.
Yeah, and I think that we actually discussed Elite Barbarians in the last time that you came on. Have your opinions changed? I remember I asked you what your opinion was of them being a common. Did you see that as an issue, or rather as almost a strength to the card? And then you answered that you have no big problem with it. Do you still stand by that?
I stand by that. I think that people have become much better at responding to them, particularly under tournament rules or at the top of the ladder where everyone has cards that are similarly leveled. There's no problem up there. They are somewhat of a problem lower down in the arenas, where if you are a level 9 player and you're going up against level 12, even max level Elite Barbarians, they're extremely daunting, and it requires some very careful play to be able to counter them. But that's sort of a problem for every card in the game, right? If I stuck a max level balloon right on top of your head, you would probably be feeling the pain if you were at level 9 or, level 10 arena towers trying to shoot it down.
Exactly. Yeah, I totally agree. In my mind, and I put out a whole video just talking about Elite Barbarians, and I, took a lot of bullets there because I was saying the same thing that you are right now, that yeah, they are a common and they are over-leveled and they do totally dominate, like you said, that trophy range from like whatever, 2,500 to 3,500 or whatever to 4,000. And the fact of the matter is, and they even dominate tournament play to a large extent. They're pretty popular, at tournament level standards. But I like the card, and I think that it's actually a boon to free-to-play players to have common cards that are super powerful, because it gives them the option of actually competing at higher level ladder play than they normally would be able to. Like you said, a max level balloon coming at you is definitely an issue, but you as a free-to-play player or someone who's not spending a lot of money on the game, you normally don't even have that option at all. So the alternative is to remove these common cards, and then you're stuck just complaining that the game is pay to win, right?
I totally agree.
So, okay, let's move on a little bit from the Elite Barbarians. Well, actually, let's not move on. Let's get into our next round of conversation. And why don't you tell me, should anything be done about Elite Barbarians? There's no doubt that they're really powerful still, with all that said. So do you think they need a small nerf? If so, what would you recommend?
I don't think that anything should be done particularly about the Elite Barbarians. I think that the better change would be to modify the game economy overall so that rares... so that epics and legendaries scale a little bit better, so that you're less likely to max out your commons and then still have rares and epics that are 2 or 3 levels below that. I think that commons should become, ironically, less common, and that you should get more rares and epics at comparable levels, so that when you go up against these really high-level commons, you actually have a defensive ability to respond to them, rather than just saying, this card is, not working well because it's so popular at the common spot, so we need to nerf it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Do you think that maybe the answer is adding in like a new strong common defense card?
There's something to be said about that. Rather than just nerfing one card, you can give it a hard counter. Mm-hmm. A lot of people have been concerned about graveyard and spellbait decks, and I'm really looking forward to the Executioner because I know he's going to do very well against them.
Yes.
If there were a card that could distract the Elite Barbarians and do a lot of damage to them at the same time, I think that card would be very strong. And as we've seen on the ladder, in fact, the card that I think performs extremely well against Elite Barbarians, the Skeleton Army, which gums them up really quickly and does a lot of damage, has risen quite precipitously in popularity. It's now, I think, the number 6 most used card.
Yeah, that's awesome, and that's like one of the cool things about having a powerful card is that all the counters to that card get in a bump as well, kind of in proxy to the powerful card because people start playing them more to counters. So it does give life to other cards as well. So the graveyard certainly Tombstone a little bit, and and so on and so forth. What do you think about graveyard? Do you think that deserves a nerf?
Graveyard, I'm starting to think might need a nerf. I have been kind of hesitant to say that in the past because I like the fact that we have a very strong offense-only card. But as players are using it at level 3 at the top of the ladder and doing quite well with it, dominating if they can get it even higher than that, and doing well under tournament rules just with the level 1 graveyard, it's becoming pretty apparent that it's very easy to punish an opponent who uses the one or two troops in their deck that they need to counter the graveyard. So if your opponent plays their archers or their minions on an opposite lane to go attack, you are pretty much ripe to set up for a really strong graveyard counter that they can't really oppose in any one way. So I think that graveyard just, as a result, becomes a very swingy card where either it doesn't work at all or it just absolutely obliterates you. And there's some element of fun in that. Sparky kind of works the same way where it either makes no connection at all or your tower just gets taken down all the way. But I think that it's a little bit easier to counter some of the other cards that are like Sparky, which has counters, which are, basically every card in the game. The graveyard requires a very specific and a very well-timed counter in order to shut it down. It's very difficult to do it for less than 5 elixir, especially if your opponent is able to support it with additional spells like Fireball or Freeze.
Yeah, do you think maybe the solution might be making the duration either slow or, shorter or longer? If it's shorter, then you can, time your zap very well and take down like the whole thing. Or if it's longer, it will give your tower more time to catch up with the spawn rate of the skeletons. Or do you think it's just more something other than that? Or maybe buffing a counter as an indirect nerf?
Perhaps if they reduce the duration, that would be a good way to ensure that so many skeletons don't get stacked up onto the tower. Reducing the radius, I'm not even sure if that would be a nerf or a buff because you would have a little bit more control over where the skeletons spawn in the first place. One of the big downsides, in fact, of Graveyard is that you have to kind of awkwardly place it on the outside edge of the tower. Otherwise, you risk activating the King Tower. It's kind of hard to say what necessarily would nerf it. Maybe you would just reduce the spawn time, I think would be the easiest way. Fewer skeletons are easier to deal with.
Yeah, agreed. So you mentioned Sparky and Inferno Dragon, kind of the same deal with Inferno Dragon, where there's just so many cards being played, especially with Zap being the most popular card in the game. There's so many, reset cards. Is there any way to save poor Sparky and Inferno Dragon as a secondary option there?
It's so hard to say. I think that the Sparky cannot ever really afford to have its charge reset. Sparky should be a way to test your opponent's ability to swarm or kill it with flying troops, and the fact that you can just reset it really easily with a zap, even if you're packing lightning, that'll reset it now. Just makes it extremely difficult to run. Yeah, Ice Spirit will reset it. There's just a ton of different ways.
Wizard.
Exactly, man. Yeah. We can go across the Sparky all day. But yeah, Inferno Dragon is also having a lot of difficulty even after the most recent round of buffs. I think that the core weakness that it is unable to deal with, a lot of different troops like minions, spear goblins, musketeer, a lot of things just get through it too quickly. And I think that the design idea behind Inferno Dragon was that it ramps up its damage at the same rate as an Inferno Tower. That might have to go. That might just be the thing that makes Inferno Dragon unplayable. The fact that it's a troop rather than a tower just might, be the killing factor there because it needs to have that quicker DPS in order to take out an enemy. Either that or it needs a massive hit point upgrade or perhaps a range increase so that it can start attacking its opponent a little bit sooner.
Yeah, it seems like a really simple fix, but that was kind of my idea on both of these, Sparky and Inferno Dragon, is maybe just give it, like you said, like a massive HP buff, and it's not going to really solve any of the fundamental issues that you run into playing those cards, but it's going to give you more leeway to at least, anticipate what your opponent's going to play as a counter and have time to adjust and try to counter that. So, it might be a start for those cards. And, you always run the risk, too, of a little buff sometimes can go a long way, and unanticipated OP cards can kind of breed that way. But, I do agree with you. What I wanted to do is kind of move on. Instead of touching every single unpopular card individually, I wanted to ask you what you think of the non-splash damage, tanky or kind of higher cost elixir cards such as P.E.K.K.A, Prince, Giant Skeleton. Is there a way to make those cards more viable? They just seem kind of almost slow and outdated in the current meta.
Well, as we've seen with the change to Elixir Collector, putting 6 or more Elixir down in any one lane makes you very vulnerable to counterattack in the opposite lane. The same sort of thing we saw with the Bowler, where when his cost was reduced from 6 to 5, he pretty much instantly became very viable and quite easy to use. So I think that if you want to be able to save a card like P.E.K.K.A, which costs 7, it needs to have a big impact immediately when played. The fact that the deploy time is so high and that it can be easily distracted makes it very difficult. Even when you are playing it kind of in the ideal circumstance, dropping it right on top of like a Golem or a Giant or a Royal Giant, it still doesn't often get the value that you are looking for on defense. And then you also need to get value on counterattack. And with Skeleton Army and Tombstone being very popular, I think that maybe even a decrease in the P.E.K.K.A's range of sight so that it gets less distracted by these enemy troops would help it out. And I guess a lot of the same criticisms apply to some of the other bigger troops. Prince actually used to be really popular. I think that it might actually deserve a comeback now that Giant is doing quite well again. But it just is kind of lacking in targets right now. There's a lot of zap bait decks. There's a lot of graveyard decks that the Prince just gets really frustrated by because he doesn't have anything to charge into.
Yeah.
So he's just not really very good in the current metagame.
Yeah, doesn't it seem that, I know this isn't the case, but doesn't it seem like if you just buff some of these really underused cards, to the point, it's such a delicate exercise, but if you buff some of these underused cards to the point where they're just viable enough to enter into the meta, then we could truly have like a really expansive and vast meta with like all types of different cards in the game. But it just never seems like that's really the case. It always seems like there's a dominant, 4 or 5 or, maybe even a few more decks that kind of, are tweaked here and there. But it never seems like we can expand upon, this guy's playing, whatever, the P.E.K.K.A double Prince deck again. Like that's not, it's just not even viable. Is there a way, do you think, to make like a 10 deck or 10 archetype meta, or is that just too tall of a task?
I wish that it were possible. It's just the difficulty is knowing when to stop, right? The developers obviously know what they're doing and they're working very hard to achieve that goal of having an extremely diverse metagame. But the fact that half the cards are used by 2 or fewer players at the top of the ladder right now, and there's really only about 5 or 6 win conditions that are being relied upon, shows me that either the developers are having difficulty in achieving that level of balance that they're looking for, or players are just really stinking good at finding the optimal way of doing things. I'd like to see some buffs to some of these weaker unused cards, but it's very difficult to say how much is too much. I actually thought that the poison buff that was recently introduced was going to be way too much and it was going to become stinking overpowered and, really crazy. But it turned out that the poison buff wasn't even enough and only 2 players at the top of the ladder are using it.
Yeah, that's crazy too. I was with you there. I think we might have talked about that, but it's interesting to see how you're right. When these good players, once they get a hold of a new meta, or it seems like even days later they adjust, and the people who adjust quickly are the people who really can take advantage of changes in the meta. So what do you think changes into the meta might come with the 4 new cards that are coming over the next few months? The Goblin Gang, the Battering Ram, Executioner, and Dart Goblin. So do you think they might carry with it changes to the meta? Are any of them that, game breaking or game changing?
I absolutely think that they are. The Dart Goblin's going to be pretty good against Graveyard, I think. He will probably replace archers and the kind of smaller troops in a lot of decks if Graveyard continues to be really popular. I think that Executioner is going to do very well against the Zap Bait decks that have been very popular recently. One of the big difficulties that you have on defense against these is that even if you use your Zap against a Goblin Barrel and get a +1 positive elixir trade there, you then have to face down goblins running in or a minion horde flying on top of your tower, and you just don't have enough ways of dealing that splash damage in a reliable way, but the Executioner provides that. And then finally, Battering Ram, I think is going to be an awesome win condition. I'm really excited about it. I think that it might even be used alongside the Hog Rider just to be able to cycle kind of continuous troops that go directly for an enemy structure.
Yeah,
I think that they're going to have a big splash. I'm not exactly excited about Goblin Barrel. I think Zap Bait is already doing quite well. Clone didn't really change Zap Bait too much, and I think the Goblin Gang, or maybe I said Goblin Barrel.
Yeah, but we know you meant.
I was talking about Goblin Gang. Yeah.
Goblin Gang, it's interesting. I mean, in a way, they could be really good against Elite Barbarians, another pretty cheap counter to them. But also, it's just tough for me, it's tough to tell with Goblin Gang. It could be one of those cards that's widely used, or it could be one of those cards that kind of has a stale introduction to the game, kind of like Clone. And Clone, how about Clone, man? I mean, Clone is, I hate it. What do you think? What do you think of the Clone spell?
I thought it was going to be a lot of fun. I got to play it in Helsinki before it was released to the public, and I was absolutely crushing with it. I was playing it mostly in Zap Bait decks alongside Skeleton Army and Minion Horde and things like that. But players are really good. They've figured out that you only need a little bit of damage to take the clones out. They save their spells whenever they know that they're up against a clone deck. And so you really only get one opportunity to surprise your opponent and just dump a massive amount of damage on their tower. And if you don't take it down in that one push, you're kind of out of luck.
Yeah, like with everybody playing either Zap or Ice Golem or both, it's like even Ice Golem takes out anything cloned, by its death damage. So it's just like, crap, So I shouldn't say I hate it. I like the concept. It just doesn't work, especially right now where everybody's carrying, several, not just one, but several of those low damage, instant direct damage abilities. But let's talk a little bit about if we could kind of speculate on where the meta might go. So let's pretend that Elite Barbarians are relatively the same. Maybe they see a slight nerf. Maybe there's a buff to some siege. You'd be a happy guy if so. And then what do you think could be coming down the road? We've seen this recent resurgence of air. Do you think that trend will continue? And it's interesting because even without the buffs and the nerfs, it seems like the players themselves kind of dictate in a way where the meta goes, where the popular decks kind of move according to what cards are more popular. So what do you see the next change being, if you had to kind of guess?
That's a great observation, and even if there were never any future balance updates, and I'm sure that there will be, but even if there weren't ever any future balance updates, the most popular cards would tend to change over time as players evolve their decks to respond to the biggest threat. To answer your first question, I think that air is on the rise. We saw 2 weeks ago with the last card popularity snapshot that players were starting to pick up the usage of Lava Hound. I think I talked about Hazard, who has a really good Lava Hound balloon deck that is now becoming very popular at the top of the ladder and has been tearing up tournaments left and right. The fact that that has been the case has brought the return of Musketeer, which we hadn't really been seeing very much in the past several months. And so we might even come full circle again and find Lightning in a lot of decks to deal with Musketeer and Mega Minion, seeing as Lightning is hardly ever used right now, but is a very good counter to a lot of the cards that are used to respond to Balloon and Lava Hound.
Yeah, for sure. And do you see, I also see a little bit of Control kind of creeping back. Do you think that Control, and more specifically, maybe even Minor Control, like old school Minor Control, do you think they might make a comeback?
It's been having a lot of difficulty, to be completely honest. We saw 4 appearances of a Bowler Minor Control deck that kind of relied on Zap Bait as its secondary win condition, running a Goblin Barrel, Skeleton Army, and Princess. But it's really more kind of a hybrid of the CG Zap Bait, kind of always pressuring you with a bunch of little dudes rather than a straight up Minor Control, just throw spells and throw miners on the tower and get elixir efficient defenses.
Yeah, that was my favorite. I'm kind of bummed, kind of like you in Expo. I'm really bummed out about Minor Control or really pure control decks. They just, As much as you kind of try, they're just not super viable. You can win some matches, but I just don't feel like you're gonna have a ton of success. At least me, with my mediocre skill level, I just can't make them work anymore.
You're too humble, Ash. I gotta say, I think that the control decks can tend to work a little bit better under tournament rules. So the card popularity snapshot may not be as forgiving toward them as it ought to be. There's just a lot of ways that are competing with control decks that can get a lot of big, heavy damage on the tower really quickly, whereas the control decks kind of tend to rely a little bit more on chip damage and just getting that slow but reliable little bit of, a few hundred damage here, a few hundred damage there to eventually take a tower down. It's much more difficult to do on ladder than it is in tournament rules where you have those additional 2 minutes of overtime.
Yeah, I totally agree. Totally agree with you there. I think tournament and ladder, totally different ball game. It's weird, and I actually love it. But that's another story for another day, I guess. And before I let you go, any final words, any parting words, and maybe it is a rapid fire question for you. If you could buff any card, any of the underused cards, what do you think would be the most deserving card? Not for you specifically, but just for the overall betterment of the meta.
Which one card would I buff for the overall betterment of the meta? I guess I would say P.E.K.K.A. We talked a little bit about it earlier, but we've seen some control decks that utilize the bowler, and we've seen some beatdown decks that utilize giant work very well. And the fact that Inferno Tower doesn't really counter them, I guess I'd have to say P.E.K.K.A. would have to be the one card that I would buff, or maybe Inferno Tower. Just something to be able to take out these big bodies in an efficient way, or in a way that provides for a big, strong counterattack.
Yeah, 2 quick notes. Number one is I don't think they've ever added a new defensive unit in the game since it's been alive. Am I wrong there?
Yeah,
they've added buildings. They've added the furnace.
Right.
I can't think of unless
that was the first one that came to mind for me. But yeah, there's been no new defensive turrets. Let's say.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's time for that. But my idea to buff P.E.K.K.A. that I just came up with right now, so it might be stupid, but is to give the P.E.K.K.A. another sword. It's the dual-wielding P.E.K.K.A., so he's not splash damage, but he can hit 2 targets. That might be a little bit too much of a buff. Okay, a huge damage nerf, but 2 swords. How you like that?
Yeah, like half the damage, but because double
speed. Yeah, exactly. He needs something more than just, in my mind, he needs something more than just a damage buff, because that's not the issue. He does a lot of damage, but yeah, he just needs something more, at least, or maybe a cost decrease. Think of how much value you get out of Lava Hound for 7 elixir. You get the pups, you get the great tank, you get the targeting buildings and defenses, and look at the P.E.K.K.A. It's just like, yeah, whatever, man. I'm not impressed, P.E.K.K.A.
Well, I think you're right about that. P.E.K.K.A. needs some work. That would be a good way. That'd be an interesting way. I don't know if it's going really with the flavor of P.E.K.K.A. though. I feel like P.E.K.K.A. really is the heavy hitter, and having the damage would take away some of that. But
yeah, you're right. Well, we'll brainstorm. We'll reconvene in 2 weeks, and we'll talk about snapshot, and maybe we'll have some better ideas for buffing the P.E.K.K.A. other than massive damage nerf and dual wielding swords. So thanks so much for coming on there. Where can people find you if they want to get a hold of you and praise your wise words?
Well, thanks, Ash, once again for having me on your channel. It's always a pleasure to speak with you, and I enjoy the opportunity to connect with your viewers. You can check me out here on YouTube. WWoody123 is my username here, as it is on Reddit and on Twitch. And then if you'd like to follow me on Twitter, I'd hope that you'd come check me out. I'm at Woody_CR.
Excellent. So guys, follow Woody, check him out, watch his streams, all great content. And Woody, thank you so much for coming on again, man. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely, dude. Shout out to Reddit Alpha. Hope you guys over at Elite Gaming are doing well. Been having a lot of fun recently in some big community events, and look forward to more in the future.
Hey, thanks a lot, man. Same to you. And there you have it, guys. Hope you enjoyed this conversation with Woody. Be sure to check out all his links in the description below. If you have any suggestions for future episodes in this series, go ahead and leave them in the comments. Guys, thanks for watching. Really appreciate it. And as always, take care, guys.